Welcome back to the GCN Racing News Show. This week, how did Tao Geoghegan Hart win the Giro d'Italia? Yes, I know he covered the route in the least time, but I will go into a bit more depth than that. We're also going to wrap up the first week of La Vuelta a España, and we'll say farewell, within pro cycling at least, to the legend that is Adam Hansen. He rode his last pro race yesterday. We will start though with the Giro d'Italia. How exactly did Tao Geoghegan Hart win the thing? Wind back 3 weeks and he, like the rest of his Team Ineos Grenadiers teammates, was here to support Geraint Thomas's bid to top the GC and take his second Grand Tour. That started very well for them, with Thomas the best of all the expected GC contenders on the Stage 1 time trial, but then just 2 days later, disaster struck. He hit that rogue bidon in the neutralised zone of Stage 3, fracturing his pelvis and therefore not starting the following day's stage. And so it left Ineos in a bit of limbo, and we thought just chasing stage wins. And they did pretty blooming well on that front, didn't they? 4 for Ganna, 1 for Narvaez, and in the end, 2 for Geoghegan Hart, making this the team's most successful ever Grand Tour, statistically speaking anyway. 7 stage wins from 21 and the general classification, and the team's classification, and the young riders classification. Not a bad haul. It was after the first of Geoghegan Hart's stage wins though to Piancavallo that we realised for the first time that he could also be a threat on the GC. In fact, judging by this part of his post-race interview after stage 15, I don't think it had even dawned on him by that point that he might be able to take the biggest win of them all.
But you are yourself very close to the podium now. Is today's win just the beginning?
I don't know, I haven't seen the results. For me, it was, crossing the line first is something truly incredible, and this one was for Nico Portal especially. We lost him this spring and it's been really difficult for the team, I think. Not only that, but all the season. We've had some great highs, but also some big lows in the Tour, and for me personally, and also even in this race. So we just have to show the Grenadier spirit that we're trying to foster in this team, and keep bouncing back like we know we can.
Yeah, he hadn't seen the GC at that point, but he was 4th, just 1 second off the podium. And in hindsight, it's interesting to look back at his results over the opening week of the race to track his ascendancy. So in that opening time trial, he finished 126th, 2 minutes and 4 seconds behind his teammate Ganna, 36 seconds behind Kelderman, and 49 seconds behind Jai Hindley. Both Kelderman and Geoghegan Hart had been amongst the later starters though, for whom the wind had changed unfavourably, whilst Hindley was the 5th man off the start ramp that day. On stage 3, which was the day Thomas crashed out, Geoghegan Hart finished 24th, 1 minute 42 seconds behind the riders who had, at that point, become the race favourites, Vincenzo Nibali and Jakob Fuglsang, and 1 minute 54 down on Wilco Kelderman. And it left the Brit 24th on general classification, 3 minutes 12 behind Almeida, and 2.5 minutes behind Kelderman, who was already up to 4th place on GC. Wasn't necessarily a surprise that Geoghegan Hart was that far down though, because it's not easy to change your mindset from one of domestique to leader during a single stage, which is exactly what Geoghegan Hart had to do after that. And he did change his mindset, even if the team as a whole had been instructed to go for stage wins, and it was on that stage 9 that he made his first significant move up the general classification. There, on a cold, wet day to Roccaraso, he slipped away from the group of favourites with Lucas Hamilton of Mitchelton Scott for company, and whilst he may have only finished 22 seconds in front of the big names and only moved up 2 places on GC, he was on his way up. He, Kelderman and Hindley finished on the same time as each other for the following 4 stages, and then came the second of the 3 individual time trials. There, 37 seconds separated Kelderman from Geoghegan Hart in the Dutchman's favour. Tao though had moved up 1 place on GC, but he was still outside the top 10 and still 2 minutes 48 behind Kelderman. Now the first sign, I think, that Tao might have been able to finish even on the podium came the following day. That was at the end of the second week, where Team Sunweb destroyed the entire field, with only Geoghegan Hart able to stick with them before sprinting past them to take his first Grand Tour stage win. That day propelled him up 7 places on the general classification and into 4th, just 1 second behind Jai Hindley in 3rd. So, what do you do if you are 25 years old and eyeing up your first Grand Tour podium? Do you concentrate on cementing that spot, or gamble it all and go all out for the win? Well, we got our answer to that on the Queen stage. 203 kilometres with 5,800 metres of climbing, including the monster that is the Stelvio. There, Team Sunweb rode initially, as you'd expect. They were most concerned with dropping Almeida on the lower slopes of the climb, which they duly achieved. However, what they and we hadn't really reckoned on was Rowan Dennis having the ride of his life in the mountains. Now, he's always been touted as a rider who could potentially ride for general classification if all went to plan, but the ride that he did that day was off the charts. He drilled it so fast up the second half of the Stelvio that he dropped Kelderman. And so it was just him, Tao Geoghegan Hart and Jai Hindley together at the top of the highest point of the race. That, though, was a big tactical decision by Team Sunweb at the time and gave us that big debate as to whether Hindley should have waited to pace his leader. Now, I certainly wouldn't have wanted to make that call myself from the Team Sunweb car behind. Regardless, though, on that day, stage 18, they got the stage win and the pink jersey and second overall, so a lot to be proud about. Although it did mean that Geoghegan Hart, though, had closed to within 15 seconds of the race lead himself. Now, it really cannot be underestimated just how big a part Rowan Dennis played in the outcome of this year's Giro d'Italia. His Stelvio performance was backed up in a very similar vein on the revised penultimate stage to Sestriere. Just Hindley and Tao were able to keep his pace, and in that battle it was actually Tao who took the spoils, and it left us with a tie on time going into the final day's time trial. Hindley in pink by virtue of a countdown on split seconds from the first two individual time trials of the race. Never before has a Grand Tour been so close going into that final day, basically tied on time. Tantalising stuff, and now it was Geoghegan Hart that started as the favourite of the two for the pink jersey in the end, and that billing was justified because he put 39 seconds into Hindley and finished 13th on the stage, and therefore won the Giro d'Italia by the same amount of time. Nobody could have predicted this at the start of the race, but once again in 2020 we've seen that a new generation is taking over in pro cycling. In fact, 3 of the top 4 on the general classification were eligible for the Best Young Rider competition, and that hasn't happened since the 1971 Tour de France, although there actually wasn't an official Best Young Riders classification back then. For Ineos, what could have been a disaster after Thomas was forced to leave turned into their most successful Grand Tour ever. Ganna won that final stage, making it 4 stage wins for him, 7 for the team, and the general classification, and as I mentioned, the team's classification too. Their previous record came in 2012, where they took 6 stage wins and the GC at the Tour de France. That was their first Grand Tour win, actually if you exclude Froome's 2011 Vuelta win after Kobo's title was retrospectively stripped. So Geoghegan Hart is the 5th rider from that team to win a Grand Tour, and here is what he had to say to Brad Wiggins on the breakaway after he'd sealed the deal.
It was a nice parkour for just focusing on yourself, you know, it wasn't tricky, it was just about putting the power down, and it's always nice when you have that feedback, you know that your opposition can't do what you're doing, it gives you confidence and you just go deeper and you push more.
You've looked like a different rider for the last week, like your confidence just seemed to go through the roof, and you just looked like you had an air of confidence about you from the moment you started sprinting for that first stage win when you won up the mountain.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, last year in the Vuelta I felt super good in the last week, and I was kind of more or less climbing similar to some of the GC guys. I just took confidence from that, you know. That was the big thing that Nico really gave me, was just to believe in myself going into the race, that it's so different in it after 3 weeks. So yeah, I felt great this week. Again today, the legs felt maybe the best of the whole race, obviously with a big prize to chase, so pretty cool.
Meanwhile, Hindley's journey to second on GC is just as interesting, because he too would have gone to Italy with the job of working for somebody else, namely Wilco Kelderman. But in the end, he outclimbed his leader. So in the opening time trial, he did perform really well, but on the first mountaintop to Etna, although he put significant time into Geoghegan Hart, he also lost significant time to all the other favourites. The first real sign of the form that he had was on the stage to Roccaraso, where he finished with Fuglsang and Kelderman, and from that moment onwards, he was always with the best, or in front of them in fact, on the major climbs. He did have a poor time trial towards the end of the second week, which left him in 10th on GC, 1 place in front of Tao. But the following day, he did one of the rides of the race, flying up Piancavallo, and there we saw who were the 3 strongest riders in the race and who ultimately filled the 3 steps of the podium. His stage win on day 18 was a bit of a coming of age for him, as was his runner-up position in the general classification. We've not seen the last of Jai Hindley, I'm very confident in saying that. Kelderman in the end would have to settle for 3rd place, a result I'm sure he'd be initially a bit disappointed with, despite it being his best performance at a Grand Tour. I'm sure he'll be pleased with it soon enough. Hats off too to João Almeida of De Koning Quickstep, a man who has given us so much to talk about over the last 3 weeks. 22 years old, riding his first Grand Tour, and he finished it off with a 4th place on the final stage and 4th on GC. I'm just wondering whether or not he'll be content now to start working at the service of Remco Evenepoel next year. We shall see. Anyway, I must say, we really excelled ourselves in our predictions in the Giro preview show this year.
So I'm going to go with the Danish. I'm going for Jakob Fuglsang.
And I'm going to go for Simon Yates.
Jakob Fuglsang.
Superman Lopez.
My head say Jakob Fuglsang.
I don't think we even mentioned the top 3 once in the whole 20 minutes. So even by our standards, that's quite something. Although I think I may, well, I guess you'll decide this, I may have redeemed myself on the World of Cycling GC watch filmed last Tuesday morning. Do I think he's going to win? I really don't know what's going to happen in this race. I do kind of feel like Jai Hindley's not going to leapfrog him because he's so far behind it, he'll be working for Kelderman. Tao's got a lot of time to make up, but did look exceptional on that final day before the rest day on Sunday. So if I had those other magnets here, I would put Jai Hindley at the same place as Almeida and Micah. I would put Tao Geoghegan Hart equal with Kelderman here, and therefore have no out-and-out favourite. Is that too much on the fence? All right, Tao for the win. There you go. I'll take that. Now, this being 2020 with all of its eccentricities, we also had another Grand Tour running at the same time for the past 6 days. Not unprecedented because the Giro and the Vuelta had overlapped a couple of times back when the Spanish race was held in the spring, but nevertheless, it did make it quite hard to keep up with things at times. With the race missing the opening 3 stages that had been scheduled to take place up in the Netherlands, it meant that there was no easing themselves in at the race. The first 3 days were all fought out amongst the GC contenders, and already on day 1, last year's winner Primož Roglič was back in the red jersey. Up in the Basque Country, he attacked on the final short descent down to the finish line and took the red jersey, of course, with it. He then followed that up with a 2nd place on day 2 behind Marc Soler and another 2nd place on day 3, this time behind the Irishman Dan Martin of the Israel Startup Nation. For Soler, it marked his 2nd win of the year, and amazingly, it was only Movistar's 2nd win of the year too. I'm pretty sure they've never had a season in their 40-year plus history in which they've won less. The great thing for them, though, was that that win came very close to their team headquarters. For Dan Martin, it actually marked the first victory since the 2018 Tour de France, and it clearly meant an awful lot to him.
Every single one of them played a part in today's victory, and yeah, it's part for them and part for my wife as well, because this is the first time I've won a race since my kids were born, and it's really special. Sorry.
Well done, Dan Martin, and well done too to Sam Bennett, who took the first of the sprinters' opportunities which came on stage 4. Jasper Philipsen had looked good to take it with 100 metres or so to go, but Bennett's superior power just basically got him over to the line first. He becomes the 4th Irishman to have won a stage of 2 different Grand Tours in the same season, and that actually was the first time that 2 different Irishmen had won back-to-back stages at a Grand Tour ever. On Saturday, it was the first success for a breakaway at the race, with Tim Wellens taking his first win in over a year. And then on yesterday's stage, much like the penultimate stage of the Giro, it had to be rerouted so as not to go onto French soil. There's been a significant increase in COVID security measures there. So unfortunately, there was no Col du Tourmalet. We did, though, still have a mountaintop finish, and it was won under fairly grim conditions by Jon Izagirre of Team Astana. He'd been part of a very big and very strong early breakaway. This, though, is how the GC looks after that first week of the race. Richard Carapaz is up into red, leading the race. A bad day for Primoz Roglic, who had a mechanical problem and then not great legs. So he is now in 4th place on GC. 18 seconds behind Carapaz is Hugh Carthy of EF Pro Cycling, and 20 seconds behind him is Dan Martin. We have a race on our hands, and it'll all resume on Tuesday, where we'll be back with live coverage and post-race analysis on the breakaway each evening. Meanwhile, up in Belgium, we had the men's and women's Driedaagse de Panne, a one-day race that has kept its name from previous years. In the women's race, it was very aggressive, and so it was a reduced group of fewer than 20 that fought it out for the finish and the win. Crossing the line first was Jolien Dora, the ex-Belgian champion of Boels-Doelmans, but she was later relegated for deviating from her line in that sprint, and so it was Lorena Wiebes of Team Sunweb who took the win there. That's actually her 3rd win in a season in which she's only seen 8 days of racing for her. Here's hoping we see her more in 2021. Now in the men's race, most of the riders were doing their final day of competition this season, and what a brutal day they had to finish it off with. High winds cut through the peloton right from the very off, and I'd say it was probably the hardest day of the season for many of the riders there. At least for those that finished, of which there were only 49 in the end. For Tim Merlier, it was painful in more ways than one. Here he is just about holding it up after a skirmish in the crosswind. Ouch. His teammate Mathieu van der Poel had also been a part of the front group, but he crashed into a ditch and was unable to continue, suffering from concussion. If his recovery goes well though, we will see him compete again at the Scheelde Cross on December the 12th. His withdrawal from that race though left de Koning Quick-Step with a cast iron grip on the race with lots of numbers up front, and the man who benefited most from those numbers was Yves Lampaert. In that race, Alpecin Fenix cemented their place at the top of the UCI Europe Tour rankings for 2020, which means they will get automatic wildcard entry into the 3 Grand Tours and the big classics next year, which is good news for the team and good news for their fans as well. And actually they've been far more, haven't they, than just Mathieu van der Poel this year, that's for sure. Right, we are now going to move on to cyclocross because we had the 2nd round of the Super Prestige from Ruddervoorde on Saturday. In the women's race, with the wind and technical features in the course, no one seemed to be able to string together an entire lap without making a mistake. In the end though, 5 riders were clearly stronger than the rest of the field. World champion Ceylin del Carmen Alvarado, Anne-Marie Wurst was with her. We had the European champion Yara Castellijn. Lucinda Brown was there too, as was Manon Bakker. Alvarado making her move on the final sand run-up and creating a small but significant gap over the rest, which she then held to the finish. Anne-Marie Wurst had to settle for 2nd with Blunt in 3rd. On the men's side, it was a proper throwdown from the get-go, and basically Telenet Balois Lions versus Paul Sauzon Bingo. Pre-race favourite Toon Aerts tried his hand at thinning things out on the first lap, setting a blistering pace there, but Elie Iserbyt was able to match him. The pace then lulled, and so a number of riders were able to get back into contention. It was ultimately, though, Iserbyt that laid down the gauntlet with about 15 minutes left to race, stringing together technical section after section and ending Toon Aerts' 3-race winning streak. Aerts did, though, manage to hold on to 2nd, with Lars van der Haar finishing up in 3rd. The Super Prestige Series picks back up in Niel on November the 11th, and don't forget all those races are available to watch live over on Race Pass with worldwide coverage except for Belgium. Right, we'll finish as ever with some more transfer news. Now, with such a strange year, there are still some fairly high-profile moves coming quite late into the season. This week's is Sepp van Marken. The classic specialist has spent the last few years with EF Pro Cycling, but he's going to be heading over to Israel Startup Nation with current teammate Mike Woods next year. Alexei Viamos, who spent the last 7 years at AG2R, will spend the next 2 at Total Direct Energy, whilst Enrico Battaglin is heading home to Bardiani. The 30-year-old was given a last-minute contract by Bahrain McLaren late last year, but will now drop back down a division in cycling. Cofidis have signed Andre de Carvalho, a 22-year-old Portuguese rider who's been with Action Bermans for the last 2 seasons and who incidentally finished 5th at both Liège-Bastogne-Liège and Paris-Roubaix under-23s. Ben O'Connor, the Australian who rode so well at the Giro d'Italia, taking that fabulous stage win, will not be riding for NTT next year, regardless of whether they get a new sponsor. He's penned a deal with the French team AG2R Citroën, as they will be known next year. And actually he's the first Australian with a full-time contract at that team since Simon Gerrans way back in 2007. Having quite the shake-up there, aren't they? It's becoming very international as a team. Two riders are calling it time on their career, from that very team in fact, Axel Dumont and Clément Chevrier, both of them reasonably young, 28 and 30 respectively. And then Nico Mas, a pro for 14 years, always with Belgian teams, has ridden his last race. That was the Driedaagse de Panne last Wednesday. He mainly rode at the service of other riders, but he did take 2 pro wins, the World Ports Classic and also a stage of the Vuelta at Burgos over 10 years ago. However, the most notable retiree is Adam Hansen. The Australian rode his final pro road race yesterday on the final stage of the Giro d'Italia, and how fitting it was that he stopped his career at a Grand Tour. That was his 29th, and he finished 26th of them, including that consecutive run of 20 between 2011 and 2018. And it doesn't matter how many times I think about that record, I still find it astonishing and unbelievable that he was able to achieve it. Now, he was also noted for his attention to detail, of course, when it came to all things bike tech, including his own custom-made shoes. I'd say it's a refreshing break from the norm in the world of pro cycling, and we'd like to personally thank Adam, in fact, for always being so welcoming to us whenever we asked him to be involved in a video. He shall be missed, but he shall still be competing. In fact, it's just a couple of weeks now until he competes in his first Ironman of this season, a sport he's looking to concentrate on from now on. Now, there are so many stories about Adam Hansen. The fact that he wrote software to improve the efficiency of Lotto's planning and logistics, which was so good it was then bought by other teams. The fact that other riders in the bunch send him their race radios so that he can remove all unnecessary weight from them. But I think my favourite has to be this one. So he won a stage of the Giro d'Italia about 7 or 8 years ago, and the morning of that stage, he'd been over at the FDJ bus fixing their internet for them. You don't get many riders doing that. What a character, and what a fantastic ambassador he's been for our sport. Right, that is all for today. Don't forget to tune in for the Vuelta tomorrow, which will resume after its first rest day with Stage 7, and to the breakaway, of course, where I'll be joined by Sean the King Kelly on the sofa and Ola Chenoui from Eurosport HQ over in the Netherlands. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up with the icon down below, and if you haven't already subscribed to GCN Racing on YouTube, it's free to do so. All you need to do is click on the button below as well. See you soon, everyone.